Power in the Blood. Written by Tom Burns. Narrated by Kenneth Turner. For the kingdom of God is not in word, but in power. 1 Corinthians 4, verse 20. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. Revelation 16:6. An elderly man led them through the thick underbrush of a labyrinthine forest. Fallen limbs and pine cones crunched beneath their boots as they emerged into a long-forgotten cemetery nestled in a clearing. Clusters of simple stone monuments were scattered throughout the neglected grounds. The old man inspected an unmarked area of the earth several yards away from the nearby tombstones. After a few minutes of searching, he waved his arms, motioning his guests over to him. The two men approached. They were tall and imposing, and could have been brothers, possibly even twins. Their stark faces, severe and pale, contrasted sharply against dark overcoats and rucksacks. They exchanged glances before handing him a thick envelope. He tucked it into his heavy coat, and with a grim expression, turned and walked away, back through the tangled woods. Seizing shovels from their packs, both men began to dig. Journal entry, 1st of August, 1939. My father was a hardened, unsympathetic man. When not found unconscious on the floor of the local tavern, he was at our family home, tormenting his wife and children. One day, when I was 6 years old, he beat my older brother so savagely that he was unable to walk for several days. Perhaps he was unusually cruel as a result of his own upbringing. He was born the bastard child of an unwed mother. She was a housemaid of the man she later married. After their betrothal, my infant father was sent to his new grandmother in the nearby village, who was to raise him. The old woman never warmed to him, however, and so his road to adulthood proved quite treacherous. It was an unforgiving time for a poor child, and I would imagine the daily abuses he suffered throughout those years far outweighed the ones he dealt out later in his life. As a young adult, he was finally able to convince his aging stepfather to formally legitimize him, granting him legal right to their surname so that he could move forward in his social service career. He did so, and went on to retire from his position in the state, all the while juggling a deranged fascination with persecuting his own family. He developed a strange compulsion for beekeeping in his later years. He was completely exhilarated by such total control over so many individual creatures. I believe it made him feel like a god. He fittingly succumbed to a drunkard's death at the local village tavern. I did not mourn his death, nor do I now. The only ties that bound us were of blood and name. Both were given to us as gifts from strangers. One man, whose name I accept as my own, has a history of which I am fully aware. The other, the stranger whose blood flows through my veins, is the man I am currently researching. I am interested in finding out as much as possible about him. I feel that in learning more, I will be able to open doorways within myself that were previously locked. My sources have gathered some exciting information as of late, and the view into my grandmother's foggy past is becoming clearer. It appears as though she resided somewhere in the northeastern United States before the birth of my father. More details to follow, to be sure. Amish settlement, southeastern Pennsylvania, United States of America, 1836. A horse-drawn carriage jerked and rattled through the cool night. It clattered down a muddy road, which cut through a thick forest of pitch pine and scrub oak trees before finally splashing to a halt at the center of a small rustic village. From out of the dark, 3 men approached the carriage. All 3 had thick beards covering their chins and wore wide-brimmed hats. A spectacled elderly man, the oldest of their party, greeted the group inside the carriage and introduced himself.
"It's a pleasure to see that you all have arrived safely. Welcome to New Augsburg. My name is Elder Samuel Fisher, and these men are Brother Alois Byler and Brother Jacob Plank. Please, gentlemen, help our new neighbors with their things, if you would."
The 2 men did as requested, and the passengers quietly disembarked. Elder Fisher continued,
"There is much and more to speak of with you all, and I wish to visit with and learn about each and every one of you. But alas, the hour is late. I know that you are all very tired. Alois and Jacob will help to get you settled into your new homes, so go and get yourselves some rest now. We shall become more acquainted with one another tomorrow."
The last of the arrivals to plant his feet on the damp New Augsburg soil was a middle-aged, bearded man with cold green eyes. He had a gaunt, hungry frame, and he stood about 6 feet tall. He carried a large bundle over his shoulder and filed in along with the rest of the newcomers as they dispersed into the dark night toward their new dwellings within the village. The gaunt man opened a door into a dimly lit room. The plain space was sparsely furnished with an old single bed, a small wooden desk on which an oil lamp sat burning, and a large, dirty wool rug lying on a rough-hewn plank floor. He entered, laid his bundle on the bed, and began riffling through it. He pulled out a leather-bound book, property of Gregor Martin, scrawled in bold hand across the cover. He pored over it, running his fingers over its smooth edges. After a few minutes, he snapped out of his daze, looked vaguely around his room, then abruptly pocketed the book and exited back out into the night. A large fire crackled and burned in a pit at the center of the village. Gregor made his way over to the warmth of the flames, where he sat down and began reading. From out of the dark, a man's voice spoke.
"Hello there, Brother Gregor, is it?"
Alois politely asked. Alois Byler was a good-natured, neighborly man. A bristly auburn beard adorned his chin, complementing his warm complexion. His eyes were dark but honest, and they shimmered in the firelight as he approached. Gregor gave no acknowledgement. Alois continued.
"I see the name written there, so I can only assume that it is your name."
Gregor continued reading to himself, silently, as if no one was speaking.
"You like to keep to yourself. I can understand that. Indeed, I am a private man myself. We all are, in our own ways, I suppose. But there is a certain togetherness here. We work together and pray together. We depend on each other, you see?"
Still, no acknowledgement was given. Alois shook his head slightly, baffled.
"I see you are an avid reader. What tome is it that you have there, if you don't mind my asking?"
Still staring down into his book, Gregor finally replied. "He who meddles in affairs not his own is like one who takes a passing dog by the ears." Then, looking up at Alois, he continued, "That is verse 17 of chapter 26 from the great book of Proverbs, one of my favorite verses from the good book." Alos smiled and nodded uneasily. Gregor finished his thought. You know, a man who behaves like that is liable to get bit. Wouldn't you agree, Brother Alos? Taken aback, Alos decided Gregor would be best left to his own devices. After brushing himself off, he bid Gregor a good night and walked back into the village darkness. He expected a good night's rest would probably see them both in better spirits by morning. Gregor stared into the fire. The flames undulated, endlessly dancing to an infinite, unheard rhythm. He stood, stretching out his weary limbs. As he began to walk away, he heard soft noises from a nearby livestock pen. He approached it and rested his arms on the top railing. He leaned in and considered the dark pen. Pigs quietly grunted and huddled together for warmth. After a moment, he turned and made his way back toward the sleepy homes of New Augsburg. Gregor lay awake in his bed, the room barely lit by flickering lamplight. Although very tired, he quietly recited strange-sounding phrases to himself from his book, repeating them over and over again. Iwan tek, vor du shun, kent al rek, mahal ti shal korok. In the middle of a recitation, he yawned and rubbed his eyes. He laid the book down and reclined. Staring up at the ceiling, his heavy eyelids yielded to fatigue as he drifted into another world. He awoke with a start. It was bright in the room, as if the night had passed in an instant. After washing his face, he looked at himself in the mirror. He dressed and then left his room. Once outside, he noticed the entire village was eerily quiet. He saw no one. He called out,
"Hello? Is there anyone here?"
No answer. He knocked on doors, opened and searched houses. No one home. Every residence vacant. Gregor was alone. Returning to his house, he noticed his door was now standing open. He walked in and discovered a woman seated on his bed, her back to him. Angry and confused, he called to her.
"Hello? Hello? Who are you? What is the meaning of this? Where is everyone?"
The woman did not answer him, nor did she turn around. He heard her whispering to herself, quietly chanting strange phrases.
Iwan tek, vor du shun, kent al rek, mahal ti shal korok.
Gregor recognized these whispers as the same phrases he had been practicing. As he walked to the opposite side of the bed in order to confront her, he saw that her head was lowered and covered, looking down into her lap, where she was holding his book. She continued, unresponsive.
Iwan tek, vor du shun, kent al rek, mahal ti shal korok.
Gregor was incensed. He angrily shouted,
"Excuse me, sister, but that does not belong to you."
He leaned in toward the woman to retrieve the book from her. As he did this, she jerked her head up and glared hatefully at him. Her face was pale and obscene. Thick plumes of white smoke billowed from her empty eye sockets. Her venomous expression tightened as she hissed the phrases, louder and louder, spittle violently escaping her mouth of ruined teeth. Gregor awoke again, sweating and startled, in his bed. He rose quickly, peeking through the curtains and out the window to reassure himself. There were a few villagers milling around in the courtyard. He exhaled, relieved. Journal entry, 3rd of August, 1939. I have just received news from my sources abroad, who have successfully located the area my grandmother was to have lived. It was a small Amish settlement by the name of New Augsburg. It is of the utmost importance that they discover, and in turn deliver to me, the item for which this entire pursuit was devised. I am confident that I chose the right men for the job. They are certainly thorough, and I feel as though they truly have my best interests at heart. Communication is difficult, but I believe they are in transit as I write. By my calculations, they will be returning within a month's time with my prize. An off-topic observation. Apparently, these American Amish sects still thrive and are reluctant to embrace modern technologies, instead subjecting themselves to daily manual labor and simple living in service to God. Admirable, yes, but not sustainable. Man was created to innovate, not merely to stand audience to the rising and setting of each day's sun. This, surely, is a sign of a fundamentally flawed system. Gregor and Alos, along with the rest of the men of New Augsburg, began the day constructing an addition to the village barn. Several of the women arrived early that afternoon, setting up large tables for the communal meal. An old woman rang a large metal bell. The whole community converged around the large tables to eat. Alos caught the eye of one of the women, and they exchanged smiling glances. Gregor noticed this exchange. Alos sat down across from her. She was a few years his senior, but retained the beauty of a much younger woman. Gregor took a seat in close proximity to them. Alos unfurled a large cloth napkin as he spoke.
"What a fine-looking meal this is, Maria. You are quite the cook indeed. Do we have you to thank for such a bountiful array?"
Maria, shyly laughing, replied,
"Oh, no, I mean, I helped prepare, but
Alos cut her off, saying,
"You're being far too modest. This all looks so very delicious. And those pies."
Gregor awkwardly interjected,
Your children must rejoice when you have them out collecting apples for such delights.
Maria nervously shifted her gaze toward Gregor, embarrassed.
I don't have any children."
Alos immediately flashed from smile to scowl, rankled by Gregor's intrusion. Gregor, shamed by his ignorance, scrambled,
I am sorry. I meant that the...
Maria cut in.
"It's all right. I am unable. You could not have known."
A younger girl leaned in between them, dampening the tension, and placed glasses on the table, then filled them with cool water from a large pitcher. Alos, happy for the interruption and eager to change the subject, turned his attention towards the newcomer.
"Brother Gregor, now that you have been so capably introduced to our kind sister, Maria Anna, what can we learn of you?"
Gregor looked uneasy at the loaded question.
"That book you study, for instance. What is contained within those pages? The others were remarking as to how vigilant you are, reading from it at all hours. Tell us a bit about it, if you please."
Elder Fisher, also within earshot of this conversation, considered Gregor as he listened in apprehensively. Gregor relented.
I am a student of the original texts of our Holy Bible, the ancient languages of that time. There are meanings, implications contained within. Some of these original texts could have some quite miraculous effects, I believe.
His focus now shifted back to Maria. Effects that could possibly even shed some healing light on the particular affliction of which you suffer, Sister Maria. Maria looked a little embarrassed, but intrigued by the idea. Alos reddened with outrage.
That is quite enough on the subject.
Elder Fisher fumed, visibly upset by what he was hearing as he flew to his feet.
What you are speaking of, your scholarship, is a prideful endeavor, and is disrespectful of the laws of our Ordnung. We must strive for humility at all times, and cast off these radical ideas and acts of selfishness.
Regaining his composure somewhat, Elder Fisher finished his thought.
You would be wise to abandon these blasphemous studies, Brother Gregor, and instead focus on righteousness and humility within this community.
This quieted the conversation. Gregor looked down, unnerved and despondent, as he replied, "My apologies, Elder." Maria and Alos appeared humbled and dispirited as well. Elder Fisher stolidly nodded approval, then adjusted his black-rimmed glasses. He addressed the whole of the seated community, leading them in prayer.
Now, brothers and sisters, please join me in a word of thanks for this bountiful meal that our gracious Lord and Father has blessed us with on this fine day.
The work carried on for the rest of the day, mostly in silence. That night, after the labors of the day were complete, a pale moon crested the horizon. Gregor sat rigid at his desk. Dimly lit by the flickering lamplight, he quietly but intently recited more ancient-sounding words. Intensifying as he continued to read, he soon began sweating and shaking. There was a dirty little piglet in the room, walking around behind him as he spoke, grunting. He clenched a kitchen knife tightly in a trembling hand and repeated the phrases. Ni shani wa gahor tum raska min sla tep borshin gahal. The plain wooden house, indistinct among the other plain wooden houses, was dark and silent, barely penetrating the sound of wind as it rustled dead leaves into small piles against the gnarled plank walls. A muffled squeal escaped into the night.
Journal entry, 7th of August, 1939. I should not be so impatient. It is a character flaw I possess. I am aware of this fact, however, and am constantly working to improve upon it. That being said, I am hungry for news from my men in the field. It has been 4 days since I last received word from them. I suppose you could say I am like an old worried mother as of late. My dinner has arrived. More information to follow as I receive it.
Gregor awoke just after sunrise, stretching his tired frame to its farthest extent. He rose to face the day. The misty morning air had a crisp bite that raised goosebumps on his skin. He spotted a group of villagers nearby, surrounding a small boy. It appeared as though the boy had slipped and twisted his ankle. Gregor approached the group and spoke. "Excuse me, brothers and sisters. May I?" The bewildered villagers stepped aside for him, murmuring softly to each other. They formed a curious ring around him as he approached. He kneeled down beside the boy and began speaking passages the onlookers did not understand. That afternoon, the men were hard at work, when a few of them who had been in the crowd that morning spotted the small injured boy. He was now running and playing with several of the other children from the community. They stared in awe, as if they were witnessing him fly through the air. They looked to Gregor, who had also been surprised upon noticing the boy. Cheers resounded among them as they applauded his healing touch. A sly, satisfied look of happiness crawled across his face. He had gambled and won. Away from the crowd, the small boy broke his stride and came to a stop by the fence. He threw his elbows up over the top rail, looking down into the pen. He seemed to be counting the pigs. Still slightly out of breath from running, he asked himself a question aloud.
Hey, where did the other little piggy go?
His attention was fleeting, however, and just as quickly as he had arrived, he jumped back off the fence to rejoin the other frolicking children. Word of the supposed miracle had spread like wildfire throughout New Augsburg that afternoon. When Maria heard the news, she was excited and beaming, much to the dismay of Alos. He and Maria had something of an ongoing courtship between them. Their marriage had been forbidden years before by Alos's father. Maria was barren, and in turn, looked down upon by the community. The Amish of this village worked the land to survive, and without children, there would be no workers to sustain a family for future generations. Rebelling against his father's wishes, however, Alos had chosen to never marry, which infuriated his father just the same. Now an older man by Amish standards, his marriage prospects were few, so he and Maria were able to maintain a furtive relationship with one another. Moreover, his father was now senile and ailing, so there was little argument over the subject. Maria had been an orphan in New Augsburg, raised by the community since her arrival with a group of immigrants when she was just a little girl. It was common knowledge throughout the village that she was unable to have children by the time they were of age, but Alos did not care. He loved her in spite of her condition. As they walked together down a quiet wooded path, Maria broached the subject of Gregor.
"He is quite the mystery, isn't he?"
she asked.
"At the very least, secretive, but interesting. Wouldn't you agree?"
Alos replied curtly.
I have heard the whispers. They say he miraculously healed that boy somehow, but I cannot believe such things.
Alos stiffened as he spoke, unnerved by Maria's naivete.
Are your ideals betrayed so easily, sister? Perhaps you intend to take up with him and aid him in his research.
He asked this jokingly, but immediately they both felt the undercurrent of derision in his question. She smiled awkwardly and shook her head in dissent.
"No, I believe he is a kind enough man. That is all. Strange, yes, but I would allow him a little time to settle. He is in a strange land here, as we all were at one time. I can relate to being misunderstood as well. Do not forget, I have had my own experience as the outcast."
Alos's face went slightly pink with guilt as he smiled back at her, casting his moment of bitterness aside. He tightened his coat around himself as the evening chill quickened. Walking hand in hand, they continued on their discreet stroll through the woods. Under the cover of night, after the village had gone to sleep, Gregor crept quietly back out. He approached the barnyard, then stealthily released the piglet. It trotted away, although it now had a severe limp in its gait as it lumbered into the pen to join the others. The two large men were wedged into the back seat of a black Opel sedan as it sped down a deserted city roadway. The amber lights of the street lamps reflected off wet cobblestones, momentarily flashing out of silent existence as the car passed over them, its finely tuned engine thundering on all 6 cylinders. The car roared to a stop at the edge of an expansive wharf. Large ships were docked one after another as far as the eye could see down the boardwalk. The sedan's driver, a thin, small man in a black suit and hat, emerged quickly and opened the door for his passengers. As they ducked their heads to exit the vehicle, he pointed them toward a particular slip in the harbor. Closing the heavy car door behind them, he nodded in respect to the two towering figures as they departed. His job now complete, He briskly returned to the wheel and drove away into the damp night. The two men walked side by side down the dark pier, wholly shadowed by massive ships on either side. They soon approached the silhouette of a man at the end of the jetty. Bristled with white stubble, his face was barely visible by the light of his burning cigar, brightening only slightly as he puffed on it. The first of the two large men pulled an envelope from his overcoat and handed it to the shadowy figure. He pocketed it, directing the two up a ramp and onto the ship. He glanced around for a moment, took another drag off of his cigar, then tossed it into the brine and followed the men aboard. It was pitch black in the forest. Gregor walked silently through trees and brush, alone as he listened to the droning noises of the woods. A large campfire was glowing in the distance. He walked toward it. The fire was positioned in the center of a circular clearing surrounded by tall, looming pines. He stared into the flames for a moment and held his hands out to feel the heat that emanated from the blaze. Steadily, he walked directly into its center, his feet planted in the burning embers. The droning sounds multiplied, louder and louder, accompanied by unintelligible whispers and chanting, all approaching a fever pitch. Gregor remained calm. He raised his arms up, watching as the flames consumed him, burning his clothes and charring his flesh, his skin cracking apart. From between those cracks, white smoke rose amidst the intense heat. He began to scream, only to find that he could not make a sound. Smoke exploded from his mouth and eyes in pale gushes. Gregor was engulfed in a searing white inferno as the deafening sounds, now screams, threatened to burst his melting eardrums. Gregor awoke abruptly. He was prostrate on the ground, lying face down in the dirt and grass. There was no campfire, just a small clearing between thickets of trees, deep within the woods. He stood up slowly, disillusioned. After regaining his bearings, he dusted himself off and clumsily stumbled away through the forest, back toward the village.
Journal entry, 18th of August, 1939. Excellent news today. Word of my scouts abroad has finally arrived. They have successfully procured my prize. As sources have informed me, my men in the field met with all intended contacts and were able to secure passage back across the Atlantic aboard a vessel bound for the United Kingdom. Complications aside, they should arrive within 2 weeks' time. As the moment draws near, I am sometimes overwhelmed with emotion in anticipation of the delivery. Looking back on all the research undertaken and resources involved in arriving at this point, I feel a surge of pride in knowing that the pinnacle moment of acquisition is close at hand.
Weeks later, winter arrived in New Augsburg, blanketing the entire village under a crisp white layer of snow. The cold morning air revealed hot clouds of breath in the barnyard as the pigs and goats rummaged and rooted around for any overlooked food hidden under the dirty slush in their pens. Alos was in the barn, brushing out one of the plow horses. As he ran the brush through the horse's thick mane, he noticed a strange wound on the side of the horse's neck, usually obstructed by the hair of its mane. It was unusual, about 4 inches long and straight, and looked like a fairly recent cut. He finished brushing, and with piqued curiosity, walked out among the rest of the livestock. He discovered this peculiarity on several of the other animals. A cow, a goat, and a limping piglet all had a similar scar. Alos was unsure what to make of these discoveries, and decided to remain silent as Gregor arrived for the day at the worksite. They exchanged unenthusiastic greetings to each other in passing. Alos, only just audibly, murmured,
"Morning."
His anxieties were beginning to flower, and he was not alone. All of the villagers were on edge that day. An unprecedented murder had just occurred in the isolated community the day before. The body of Sarah Miller, wife and mother of 2, had been found in a thicket just outside the settlement, naked and frozen. Her body was bloodied and had visible wounds in several locations. Word of this crime was immediately sent out to the Baltimore Police Bureau, the closest law enforcement agency to New Augsburg. Detectives from the bureau were dispatched the next day and set out on their 2-day journey to the village. In the interim, the villagers were instructed to leave the body as unaffected as possible, as not to undermine the accuracy of the detectives' investigation once they arrived on the scene. The next morning, the villagers began arriving for church service at Elder Fisher's house. They filed in, men and women separated, as was their tradition. When the congregation was seated, Elder Fisher stood before them at a podium.
Brothers and sisters, I welcome you all once again to my home. Before I begin the sermon today, I would like to ask each and every one of you to keep Brother Miller and his dear children in your hearts and prayers.
Martha Plank, a brunette woman with a heavily freckled face, sat in the back row of the service. She began quietly sobbing and was comforted by the woman beside her. Elder Fisher continued.
As you all may well already know, English detectives are due from Baltimore this evening to aid us in this troubling matter. I have every confidence that they shall find this wolf among our flock, and the Lord's justice will prevail.
Alos glanced around the room to see Gregor, seated straight ahead, looking completely absorbed by the sermon. He was already wary of Gregor, the recent events only adding to his suspicion. He would speak to the detectives about his misgivings as soon as possible. Martha Plank suddenly burst into tears and could not be comforted as she ran sobbing out of the church service. Her husband, Jacob Plank, rose to follow. He made his way around the other men seated on his pew, then grabbed his hat and jacket from the back wall and left out the back door after her. A woman seated beside Maria whispered,
Bless her heart, Sarah's closest friend since they were little girls.
Maria solemnly responded,
So terrible. Yes, of course. And Eli, poor thing, left to raise little Josiah and Mary without a wife. Lord help him,
the woman said, dejected. Maria nodded in agreement as the whispers and anxiety rippled through the congregation. Elder Fisher called everyone back to order after the disruption and tried to calm the distressed group.
We all grieve in our own ways, do we not, brothers and sisters? Let the Lord God comfort our sister Martha and heal her in her time of need. Let us also comfort each other as we can, and praise our Heavenly Father for what we have together here on this earth.
This seemed to pacify the remaining villagers, and so the old man continued his sermon.
Now, today we will speak about the evils of conceit and avarice.
A small horse-drawn carriage, with the words Baltimore Police Bureau inscribed on both sides, bobbled and bumped its way down the snow-covered roadway toward New Augsburg. The policemen from the city arrived just after dark, Detectives Newberry and Rawlings both riding up front in the driver's seats. They were wearing dark bluish-black policemen's uniforms, with brass buttons lining their peacoats and weather-worn black leather boots and hats. Newberry looked to be a veteran detective. He was large-framed, with a head of thick brown hair and a bushy mustache covering his otherwise clean-shaven face. Rawlings was more severe, He was wiry, with shiny black hair and a thin mustache and goatee. His eyes were a piercing ice blue and did not blink. A large group gathered to greet the detectives as their carriage came to a halt in the middle of the village. Elder Fisher, at the head of the group, inquired,
"Detective Newberry, I presume?"
Newberry responded as he hopped down off the carriage.
"Yes, sir. And you are Mr. Fisher, is that correct?"
"Yes, indeed,"
Elder Fisher confirmed.
"We have accommodations made ready for you and your assistant. I can show you to them."
Newberry replied,
"That is much appreciated, Mr. Fisher. Mr. Rawlings and I would like to begin the investigation immediately. Time is of the essence, you see. We would be obliged if you and yours could help us by answering some of our questions. But, first and foremost, if you would be so kind, please show us to the body."
Elder Fisher nodded agreement.
Yes, of course. Right this way, gentlemen."
As he escorted them away, Newberry and Rawlings surveyed the villagers as they cut a path through the small crowd. The two men sat across from each other at a small enamel table. Morning light from a mist-covered window spread across the bare tabletop. The cafe was quaint and rustic. A young woman in a blue gingham dress and apron approached them, carrying 2 identical plates. Their meal included 2 fried eggs, 2 sausage links, and a buttered crumpet. The waitress placed a plate in front of each man. She went back to the kitchen, then promptly returned with 2 heavy ceramic mugs, which she topped off with steaming hot black coffee. They ate efficiently in silence, and when finished, hastily departed. As the waitress began clearing their vacated table, she noticed 2 curious silver coins the men had left as payment beside their empty plates. She picked one up off the table for closer examination. As she did so, all the color drained from her face. She rushed to the window. She was rattled, but hoped to get another look at the men before they had gone. As she peered out apprehensively through the misty pane, both men stepped into the back seat of an idling Mercedes. It was a long black limousine. No sooner had they entered than the driver sped off into the swirling fog and out of sight. The waitress exhaled a sigh of relief as she watched the car disappear. Inside the makeshift police headquarters, the detectives discussed the state of Sarah Miller's body. They made notes and prepared questions for the interrogations. The room was sparse, much like all the dwellings of New Augsburg. A large table and chairs anchored the space. Oil lamps flickered over bundled papers and small bags laid out on the tabletop. A warm fireplace crackled as the 2 men quietly made themselves ready. Newberry and Rawlings were seated side by side on one end of the table. The villagers were to be brought in one by one and seated opposite them for questioning. The first to arrive was Elder Fisher. As his questions mounted, Newberry spared no detail in describing the condition of the victim, driving Fisher almost to the point of nausea. He pointed out particular areas of interest indicated in a drawing Rawlings had made during their inspection of the body.
"As you can see, there are multiple lacerations at almost every articulation point. See here, a deep wound at the throat, under the arms, at the elbows, knees, wrists, you see?"
Elder Fisher held back tears and disgust as Newberry continued.
"But a far stranger observation is the lack of profuse blood loss. There was bleeding, of course, yes, and with so many wounds you might come to the conclusion that she was murdered in this way. But no, that would be a false assumption. These cuts were made post-mortem. That is, you see, they were made after her death. Her heart had already ceased its beating. Therefore, the loss of blood was less than it would have been had she been alive during these gruesome actions. Notice the heavy bruising around the neck. She was strangled first, and then mutilated in this way.
Newberry eyed Fisher as he spoke, all the time pondering why a community would want to live in such conditions. If they had access to more modern conveniences, he mused, this case would have been much easier to investigate from the start. A less rural area would have resulted in a much quicker response to the crime scene, thus making their efforts a little more fruitful. These notions weighed heavily on him as he made a deprecating final remark.
Had this community not been so far removed, we might have had a better chance at justice for this unfortunate victim from the very beginning, Mr. Fisher. Our trail is cold, and getting colder every moment, figuratively and literally.
Elder Fisher composed himself in a more rigid manner as he retorted.
Detective, you will find that we like to tend to matters ourselves here in this village. We survive this way, on our own, in order to maintain this way of life. Our ways seem strange to you. I understand that, but I can assure you, your ways seem equally strange to us. Please, forgo your judgment. Concern yourselves with the matter at hand. I will help you in every way that I can. Now, if that is indeed all you need of me, I must prepare a eulogy for tomorrow's funerary ceremony for your unfortunate victim, our beloved sister, Sarah Miller.
Newberry reddened, suddenly ashamed by his partial snap to judgment. Both detectives regarded Elder Fisher, then nodded to each other in some sort of agreement as Newberry replied.
Yes, well, thank you, Mr. Fisher. That will be all for this evening. Please send in our next visitor as you leave.
All three men pushed back from the table. The detectives showed the old man out and closed the door behind him. They seemed to communicate without having to speak, only looking at each other, apparently mulling it all over. Rawlings shuffled through notes and sketches in preparation for their next inquiry. That night was cold and dark. A dim light glowed out from around the edges of a curtain drawn over the window into Gregor's room. Alos crept softly along the outer wall, hoping for a glimpse inside. He managed to peek through a narrow strip on one side of the curtained window. He could make out the back of Gregor's head, and it looked as though he was seated at his desk, rocking back and forth. He might also have been drinking something, and Alos heard muffled words as though Gregor was talking to himself. With his back still turned to the spy at the window, Gregor abruptly stood up and began trembling, then convulsing, and fell to the floor in violent spasms. Alos was stunned, but unsure what to do next. Aware of his snooping, he still felt an urgency to help Gregor if he was somehow hurt. He reluctantly decided to try the door. He ran, plodding around the little house through the heavy snow to the front door. He turned and pulled on the knob. It was locked. He banged loudly, imploring Gregor to open up, and tried the door again and again in vain. He ran back over to the window to see what was happening. Oddly, he no longer saw Gregor on the floor where he lay just a moment earlier. Startled, Alos backed away apprehensively, then turned and left, confused and more suspicious than ever. Once he had gone, Gregor's head slowly emerged from one side of the exposed strip of window, peering out into the night. He looked around, saw no one, then closed the curtain more securely. By dawn the next morning, there was already new commotion stirring throughout New Augsburg. Jonas Plank, a young boy from the village, was nowhere to be found. His mother Martha was coming undone. His father Jacob was furious and sowing seeds of unrest among a community already stretched thin by tension and anxiety.
Newberry and Rawlings were speaking with the planks, assuring them that they would do everything in their power to locate their missing son. Still, distrust and suspicion only grew among the villagers as they began gathering for the funeral of their murdered friend and neighbor, Sarah Miller. They formed uneasy lines, walking in silence through an overgrown trail that snaked through the forest. A small cemetery was located in a clearing there, less than a mile from the village. 4 men acting as pallbearers, one on each corner of the wooden casket, walked solemnly as they carried it to the open gravesite. Elder Fisher spoke somberly.
Ever the caring wife and mother, this is how Sarah Miller lived her life.
The men lowered the plain coffin into the hole by ropes as the rest of the villagers wept. Elder Fisher continued.
Tragically, her flame has been extinguished far too early, as the Lord has seen fit to call her home. We all have our memories of Sarah. These memories we must cherish and hold dear, keeping her in our hearts always. Let us pray.
There stood a simple cross-shaped headstone marking her grave. Quiet sobbing rippled throughout the crowd of onlookers. Maria, standing beside Alos, was crying quietly as well. The villagers' sadness and suspicion was spreading. There was a rift growing between them, a killer among their ranks. As the ceremony concluded, they slowly dispersed, walking the path through the woods back to the village. Alos eyed Gregor as he passed. He acknowledged Maria with a smile, but looked right through Alos. She nodded back to him with a faint smile of her own as Alos fumed, unease welling within him. Walking along the snowy path with Maria, he attempted to convince her to be more careful around Gregor. The other villagers were growing suspicious of everyone, and she had been, almost solely, a friend to him. The newer members of the community, including the group with whom Gregor had arrived, were mistrusted above all. He whispered to her.
We need to talk.
Maria looked around and quietly replied.
About what?
Gregor.
What about him?
She rebutted, confrontational.
Well, don't you think he acts very strange?
He asked.
With all that's happened, I saw him in his room a few nights ago, through his window. He didn't know I was there.
Maria cut him off.
You've been spying on him? Looking in on him through a window? Have you been looking in on me?
She was outraged.
No, it isn't that. I mean,
he said, choosing his words very carefully now.
I am suspicious of him, yes. Everyone is. Do you not see it yourself? I fear the others might also include you in their suspicions.
That is absurd,
Maria snapped.
What about his ideas, his theories?
He replied quickly.
Remember the miracle he performed on that boy? Do you not think these things are worth asking questions about? Just be careful, that's all I ask. Keep an eye on him. Please, would you do that?
Maria dismissed this at first as merely Alos acting on jealousy. It was no secret that he harbored disdain for Gregor. However, reminded of the strangeness of Gregor's ideas and actions, combined with her own growing personal suspicions of him, she seemed to warm to the idea of being more watchful. In spite of that realization, however, she responded in a huff.
That is quite enough. Now please, let me go.
She withdrew her arm from his grasp and turned, walking away hurriedly, while pretending not to have changed her mind. Alos watched her leave, dispirited, but relieved that he had at least shared his concern. That evening, Alos was seated at the table opposite the detectives as they questioned him. Newberry inquired,
So, Mr. Byler, what is this information you have for us?
Well,
he began, a little nervously.
I have some concerns about one man in particular, you see. One of our own here.
Newberry responded curtly.
Yes?
Allos shifted in his seat and cleared his throat. Newberry sat up, interested.
What is it that you'd like to tell us, Mr. Byler? Please, be forthcoming.
Allos went on.
I have noticed some things. Suspicious to me. Some of his actions.
Newberry lowered his head and raised his brows in a way that suggested Allos should keep talking.
I saw him in his room a few nights ago. Gregor Martin. I was spying on him, yes, but I had reason. What I saw, it was all very strange.
Newberry leaned back in his chair, he and Rawlings now astute listeners as Allos's testimony continued. Outside, Gregor peered through the dark window into the detective's makeshift headquarters while Allos was being questioned. He watched as Allos spoke, but was unable to hear the conversation. Pulling the collar of his jacket tighter around himself, guarding against the cold wind and snow, he silently turned from his hiding place and disappeared back into the dark of the wintry village. Newberry and Rawlings, finishing up their questioning of Allos, scanned their notes. Newberry said,
These strange behaviors, along with the peculiar marks on the livestock you have mentioned, have most assuredly piqued our interest, Mr. Byler. Let's continue this in the morning at your barn. We'd like to have a look at these scars you've described. Would you meet us there, let's say, sunrise?
Allos agreed.
Yes, sir. Happy to oblige.
Newberry thanked him.
That'll be all for tonight, I think.
He pushed back away from the table and extended a hand to Allos, who nodded in thanks, shook his hand, and exited out into the cold dark. Newberry and Rawlings both stared toward the door as Allos left.
That is quite interesting now, isn't it?
Asked Newberry. Rawlings nodded agreement. Journal entry, 26th of August, 1939. More exciting news to report from my sources. My travel-weary friends have finally made landfall and are swiftly approaching as I write this entry. I have been kept very busy with other pressing matters as of late, but my thoughts still constantly drift towards my reward. This will most certainly be the crown jewel of my collection, made all the more appropriate because of its relationship to my own flesh and blood. I expect arrival within the week. Late that night, Maria could not get to sleep. Lying awake, restless in her bed, she stared up at the ceiling. She decided on a glass of water, and on her way back to bed, she noticed some movement outside. Peering out her window, she saw a single dark figure ambling across the courtyard. The figure appeared to be a man in a large hooded coat, stealthily shuffling through the snow toward the dark pathway leading out of the village. Although she had kept her misgivings to herself, intuition told her that something had been awry concerning Gregor. She wondered if this man was indeed him. Her curiosity drove her to a decision. A mysterious man bounding through the dead of night was worth investigating whether it was Gregor or not, especially given the circumstances. She dressed for the cold as quickly as possible and struck out into the snowy night. At a distance and remaining hidden, she followed the man's tracks, plodding after him on the dark path into the woods. After making his way along the trail and arriving at the cemetery, Gregor took out a shovel from under his coat and began digging up the fresh grave. He eventually made his way down to the casket. With much effort, he was finally able to extricate it from the frozen ground. He rested for a moment. After taking in several huge, icy breaths of frigid night air, he returned to his work, pulling out nails from the wooden coffin and prying off the lid. Once opened, he dug Sarah's lifeless body out of her casket and onto the new fallen snow. Maria was still hidden, just out of sight, watching in horror as these atrocities unfolded. Gregor laid the body out, flat on the ground. He roughly undressed her and discarded her clothes, throwing them into a pile of sticks and brush. He pulled a knife from his jacket, and with great concentration and effort, Gregor began cutting into Sarah Miller's corpse. Maria gasped. At the sound, Gregor jerked his head up sharply and spotted her, instantly bolting toward her in pursuit. She turned and set out at a full run, immediately stumbling over hidden roots and brush. Back on her feet, she tried frantically to escape, but Gregor was gaining on her rapidly. She loped through the snowy dark, screaming as Gregor closed in like a predator in the wild. Once he was upon her, he violently swung his shovel. It cracked against the crown of her skull, and she fell to the ground, motionless. Gregor forcefully exhaled plumes of hot gray mist and looked around in a fervor. He caught his breath. After a few moments in silence, he bent forward and began to drag her limp body through the snow. Maria was warm and comfortable. She was in a bright white room, laying on a soft white bed. She saw doctors and nurses. At least she assumed this was who they were, since they were all dressed in white. Her mind was clouded. She was disoriented. The people walked all around her, whispering quietly to each other. She raised her head up from her pillow ever so slightly, and she saw that her stomach was a large round ball. Was she pregnant? How could this be? She started to become distraught now, confused by this bizarre situation. She tried to get up, but soon realized that she was bound by her arms and legs with restraints to the bed. She pleaded with the doctors and nurses for help, but they paid her no attention. Her confusion turned to terror as she felt, then witnessed, a movement in her belly. Something was writhing inside her now. The erratic, panicked movements of a trapped animal contorted her abdomen in all directions. As she screamed and cried, the doctors and nurses encircled her, whispering in unison. Through her tears and pain, she noticed their faces. White plumes of smoke rose from their empty eyes while they hissed an unintelligible chorus. Suddenly, a new wave of agony engulfed her. Her flesh ripped open, erupting with dark arterial blood as the abomination clawed and tore its way out of her womb. Maria awoke in a daze, her head swimming. She now saw the blurred silhouette of Gregor standing by a fire, wearing something on his face and hands. Another dark silhouette stood beside him as he chanted more of those strange phrases. The silhouettes sharpened, coming into clearer focus as Maria became more aware. She realized then, in abject horror, that the second figure was the form of Sarah Miller's skinned corpse, standing upright, mimicking every movement made by Gregor. Time seemed to be passing in slow motion for her as she watched this profane choreography. Gregor took notice and turned his attention over to the barely conscious Maria. His face was covered by a bloody and grotesque mask of another human face, Sarah's face. As he twisted around toward Maria, so did the skinned, exposed muscle tissue, flesh monstrosity that had once been a woman, mirroring his every movement, both of them cocking their heads to look down on her as she struggled to speak. Maria was overcome. She slipped out of consciousness again, back into darkness. The large black limousine came to a halt on the stone driveway of an opulent mansion. Ornate granite masonry formed the broad, tall exterior walls. Decorative wrought iron railings twisted smoothly up a majestic stairway leading up to the massive entrance. 2 great wooden doors stood at least 12 feet tall, carved with intricate floral patterns and beautiful iron hardware that matched the railings. As the 2 men approached, the doors opened from inside as a short, gray-haired man stepped out to welcome them. He wore a thin mustache and a finely tailored suit with long coattails. His bow tie was worn tight around his starched white collar. He greeted the pair.
"Good day, gentlemen. I have been informed of your arrival. While his lordship is currently away on business, I was instructed to extend to you every convenience."
The squatty butler flashed a pompous smile. Neither of the 2 large men responded. They only stared back at him, stone-faced and silent. He pursed his lips and promptly continued.
"I understand that we require a change of clothes, yes? A more presentable ensemble for our arrival to the capital, I imagine."
The small man's wry grin disappeared as the stoic pair answered his questions with silence. He continued.
"Please follow me. Right this way, if you will, gentlemen."
He scurried inside, and the 2 men followed. The interior echoed the grand scale of the palatial estate. Marble floors flowed like white rivers down long hallways. Immense oil paintings hung from the walls, one after the other, in well-appointed frames. Bright light from elegant silver chandeliers flooded the space, glinting off elaborate molding and trim throughout the entire manor. As the butler drew near a curtained room at the end of the hall, he turned and faced the men again.
"Here we are, sirs. Your garments were delivered just this morning. They are ready for you here, just inside the changing room. I will have your old rags cleaned and pressed, and send them along after you when finished. Here now, I will take that for you."
As he reached for the pack slung over the shoulder of one of the large men, his arm was quickly seized in a vice-like grip. After a few strained moments, the man released the butler's arm, and both of the large men disappeared behind the heavy curtain. The butler was left standing alone in the hallway, shaken. Maria snapped into consciousness again, realizing she was now naked, bound and gagged with her own clothing. She was seated on the ground with her left arm and leg tied to one tree and her right arm and leg tied to another. Her limbs were spread several feet apart in this compromising position. The fire was still burning beside the open grave, but she sat shivering, far from any warmth it might have provided. She struggled against her bindings, wrenching at them furiously in a futile attempt to escape. Gregor, realizing she had finally awoke, turned around to face her, his grotesque human puppet still mimicking him. He curtsied, as if finishing a stage performance, this exact movement also depicted in turn by the hideous form beside him. And then he pulled the skin mask off of his face. As he did so, the mutilated remains of Sarah Miller dropped to the ground, instantly lifeless again. Gregor's face was painted dark red with blood and viscera, and he was disconcertingly calm
as he began to explain to Maria the depths of his research. "Sister Maria," he said in a more charismatic tone than he had ever taken on before. She writhed in her constraints, terrified and disgusted. Gregor approached, kneeling down before her, and began to explain. "I have found the true path. You see, miracles are nothing more than parlor tricks. Performed correctly, they can yield some quite fascinating results, as you have now been fortunate enough to witness." Gregor raised his bloody hand up to her face and stroked her hair in a way a parent would calm a frightened child, along with a quiet "shh." She moaned and tried to wriggle away as best she could. He calmly continued, "You are afraid, no doubt. That is to be expected at first, but there is no reason to fear. I am walking in the same steps as our Savior. He was a student of these dark arts, just as I am." A crazed glimmer shone in his eyes as he went on. "Who knows? Perhaps I'm even a direct descendant of our Christ himself. The blood speaks the truth, you see." Gregor brightened with a twisted smile and almost laughed at this notion, before immediately snapping back into a deadpan stare. He forcibly cradled her face with his blood-stained hands, his eyes wild and frenzied. "I have discovered some undeniable truths," he extolled, staring coldly into Maria's eyes. "The first was almost by accident." As Gregor spoke, the memory of his initial arcane act replayed vividly in his mind. He stood in his room, having just slashed the piglet's leg. After collecting its blood, he began a recitation of ancient phrases as he burned the blood with fire from an oil lamp. He then ate from the burnt offering, and upon swallowing this unholy sacrament, erupted into agonizing convulsions. "You may remember that day yourself," he said to Maria. She was his captive audience now, restrained and shivering in the snow. His memory shifted to the morning after that irreverent first rite was performed. He recalled waking on the floor of his room. Thin rays of sunlight beamed in around the curtains over his windows. He stepped outside and approached a group of villagers as they gathered around an injured boy. Gregor chanted his phrases, and as the boy stood up, Maria offered him a warm smile. Along with the rest of that bewildered crowd, she had been truly impressed by his seemingly miraculous actions. He went on with a corrupt smirk. "Now, other miracles. They require something a little more potent than a pig's blood, and can sometimes yield strange, unexpected results." Gregor now evoked new imagery from within his mind's eye. He saw himself on his hands and knees, alone in his room, vomiting relentlessly as dark, swollen veins surged then relaxed all over his face, neck, and arms. "Through trial and error I learned from my mistakes," he uttered malevolently. Gregor's morbid recollections persisted as a clear picture of him kneeling in front of the missing boy formed. The boy was gagged and bound to a chair in Gregor's room. The chair back was laying flat on a large tarp spread out all over the floor. Gregor raised the knife above his head, gripping it securely with both hands before driving it down, deep into the boy's chest. His voice brightened as he continued, "And I discovered new possibilities." He looked delighted as he relived the remainder of that previous night. He was positioned face down on his floor,
yet impossibly hovered a few inches above the ground. He floated there untethered, all the while mouthing his ancient phrases. "Different blood works in different ways," he hissed. "Mysterious ways." In that instant, another vision of Gregor's past deeds returned to him. Seated at his desk, his face veiled by a spattering of dark red, he recited incantations by candlelight, while Sarah Miller lay bound and breathless on the floor behind him. Gregor grinned at Maria, drool and gore beginning to crystallize in the foul, icy beard that clung to his chin. "Those are, in fact, the same ways in which our Lord works. Isn't that right, Sister Maria?" Altering his tone, he spoke more reverently to her now, as if trying to win her approval, or at least her understanding. "But those ways are no longer a mystery to me. The blood is the only true power, sister, and only now have I begun to realize the potential of that power." With this revelation, Gregor smiled grimly, then suddenly returned to a serious and threatening demeanor. He became aware of Maria's sobbing. She was defeated and could no longer struggle. He had broken her. He raised his knife to the side of her face and spoke quietly. Referring to her gag, he whispered, "I am going to remove this now. I'd rather you not start bellowing. It really is quite bothersome. Do you understand?" Maria plaintively nodded in agreement. Gregor cut and removed the gag. Then he stood up tall and inhaled a deep, cold breath. "But if you must, go right ahead, I suppose," he said calmly as he exhaled.
"No one can hear you!"
he screamed maniacally, inches from her face, his words echoing into the void. Maria, defeated but still defiant, pled with him with what little strength she had left.
"Whatever you do to me, they will come looking for us both by morning. You won't get away, and may God have mercy on your soul."
Gregor wistfully exhaled another cloud of cold gray smoke into the air, then replied, "You are right. They will come. They will find us. You are absolutely right about that." Maria looked up at him, confused by this response. "But I will get away. Oh, yes. And you will facilitate my escape," Gregor said confidently.
"I will not help you,"
she managed to whimper. "No, not willingly, I suppose not," he responded. "But you see, I have one last miracle to perform." He stood, his eyes set coldly on Maria, and he began to disrobe. Maria began to sob and plead with him, the terror in her awakening again. "My physical body is no longer of any consequence, sweet sister. So, like the serpent, I must shed this old skin and become new, something far superior, something everlasting." As he removed the last of his garments, Maria cried,
What are you going to do to me?"
"I'm going to heal you," Gregor gently answered. "But I must admit, there will be quite a bit of pain involved in your recovery." That terrible smile appeared once again across his hideous face. Fresh tears welled and poured from Maria's eyes. "Now,
As for the mercy of God that you mentioned.
Gregor now stood completely naked before her. He plucked a crude halo of limbs covered in long thorns from the ground beside him and crowned himself. Sharp barbs bit into the skin around his head.
You may want to begin praying now for a little of your own.
As he slowly walked toward Maria, fresh gouts of blood poured from his ragged crown, flowing down to cover his entire body in crimson rivulets. Her screams escaped into the night, but reached no one, instantly deadened by the rising snowdrifts. As dawn broke, Alos was jolted awake by a nightmare. He was worried for Maria, now more than ever. Not quite able to remember the details of this dream, one thing felt all too real to him. Maria was in danger. He made his way to her house in the earliest hours of the morning. He knocked quietly on her door. No answer. Looking around the house, he began knocking on windows and calling for her. As he trudged back around to the front door, he heard a woman wailing from the far side of the village. He ran in the general direction of the sound to find a few of the villagers huddled around Martha Plank, consoling her. Without doubt, she was the source of the scream. Detective Newberry was ushering the others away from the house, Gregor's house, as Detective Rawlings inspected a large burlap bundle laying out on the frozen courtyard.
"What's going on here?"
Alos shouted, stunned, as he ran towards the detectives.
"Maria has gone missing. She isn't in her house. We have to find her,"
he cried. He looked down at the bundle that Rawlings was crouched over, just outside Gregor's house. It was dirty and tied up with twine. It was the distinct shape of a small body, and it was caked in dried blood. Rawlings peeled back a layer of the burlap, revealing the face of a young boy, rigid and cold, his skin blue and lifeless. Martha erupted again.
"Yes, we do," replied Newberry, concerned. "And we are fairly certain who she is with. The current resident of this house is missing as well."
Earlier that morning, before sunrise, the detectives had already been following up on their suspicions of Gregor and decided to approach him before anyone else stirred in New Augsburg. They had intended to apprehend their suspect without eliciting undue attention from other villagers. Upon entering Gregor's house, however, they found it to be empty. Without delay, the duo began inspecting every inch of the room. Rawlings, a shrewd man with a keen eye for investigative detail, noticed a few spots on one of the floorboards that looked out of place. As the two men pried up the boards, one by one, they made their grisly discovery. Here was the missing boy, Jonas Plank, his killer discovered. Rawlings had been hauling the body out of the house when, coincidentally, Martha Plank happened upon the scene while on her way back from drawing water from the well. When Martha saw the child-sized bundle being carried out of the house, she dropped the pail she was toting and fell to her knees, screaming uncontrollably. Detectives Newberry and Rawlings called the villagers to order, informing them of the situation. Search parties were formed. They split up and began combing the area in and around New Augsburg immediately. Newberry, Rawlings, Alos, and Elder Fisher all spearheaded their own separate groups and spread out to cover the most ground as quickly as possible. As Alos's group slogged their way through the forest, one of the young boys of the party approached the edge of the cemetery in the woods. He stared blankly for an instant as he absorbed the obscene display. He then turned and ran back toward his group, shouting for help. When the search parties gathered and descended on the cemetery,
none of them were quite prepared for the grisly scene laid out before them. Seated with his back against Sarah Miller's cross-shaped tombstone, Gregor Martin sat naked, looking half frozen. His cold, wet eyes glowed bright against the darkness of his smoke-blackened body. Dark, dried blood coated his face and chest. A ragged crown of barbed limbs was wrapped around his head, puncture wounds in his forehead bleeding down his face. His eyes stared blankly forward, unblinking, and his mouth hung loosely agape, drooling. A dwindling fire crackled beside him, occasionally belching a few puffs of gray smoke. Beside her open grave laid the mutilated remains of Sarah, her entire body flayed of skin from head to toe. A few of the men from the search parties stood hunched over, retching, sickened by the horrible sight. The exposed muscle of her corpse gleamed. It slowly leaked thick, red fluid into the surrounding snow that began to pinken in the relative heat of the full morning sunlight. The remnants of her skin also lay scattered in dark red scraps on the ground, contrasting sharply against the bright white surface. Across from the grave sites, bound with torn clothing to trees and not moving, laid Maria. She was also naked, streaked with blood and unconscious. Newberry motioned Rawlings over toward Gregor. Alos was momentarily in a state of shock, along with the rest of the group. He snapped out of it once he saw Maria, and rushed over to her. He crouched down as he approached.
"Maria, can you hear me?"
he whispered. Covering her up with her ragged clothing as best he could, he positioned his cheek close to her mouth and nose to see if he could feel her breath. As he did this, he heard her voice, a barely audible moan. This assured him that she was indeed still alive.
"Help!"
he shouted to the others frantically.
"She's alive! She needs help! She's breathing! Help me with her!"
Some of the other men of the search party rushed over to aid him as he untied her, and they gently covered her, then picked her up. Alos stayed with her, but glanced over to see the detectives and some of the others assessing Gregor. Returning his attention to Maria, Alos and his group began carefully carrying Maria safely away, back toward the village. Newberry and Rawlings and a gathering crowd of men from the search party began to look over the abomination that was Gregor. Newberry took his pulse, barely finding one, though he did seem to still be alive. Rawlings waved his hand and snapped his fingers in front of Gregor's wide, blank eyes to no effect. He appeared to be in some type of comatose state.
"Well, he's not entirely dead as far as I can tell,"
Newberry said.
"Let's get him up and take him back into town."
Newberry motioned Rawlings to lead the rest of the men in this task.
"Get him back, and I'll follow directly. I need to have a good look at all this,"
said Newberry as he surveyed the area.
"Have the men help get some clothes on him, too. I reckon you'll not want to carry him around like that."
Newberry inspected the bizarre crown on Gregor's head and began prying it off. The skin around his forehead stretched and pulled against the embedded thorns, but eventually relented. As Rawlings and the others dressed Gregor and began carrying him away, Newberry turned his attention over toward the mutilated corpse lying in the snow. He crouched down beside it and shook his head, astonished.
Journal entry, 1st of September, 1939, number 1. Excellent news. I just received a phone call from the estate of the Lord Mayor of Hanover, informing me of my fieldmen's arrival into the city this morning. They will be here, in this room, in mere hours now. I will be breaking from my standard routine and will log a second journal entry once they arrive with my precious heirloom. This day is shaping up to be quite a busy one indeed.
Gregor was half carried, half dragged back to the village. He was thrown into the makeshift jail cell that had recently been the detective's headquarters. He laid slumped against a wall, still catatonic, and looked as though he would remain that way. The villagers were in a frenzy, hungry for justice, outraged that such a man could have lived amongst them. As the crowd turned riotous, Rawlings stood guard at the cell, doing all he could to prevent a lynching. Meanwhile, Alos managed to get Maria to the home of the only doctor in New Augsburg. The man was actually more of a farmer-turned-veterinarian by necessity alone, but he began administering what medicines he could to the injured woman as he cleaned and bound her wounds. Alos peeked through the doctor's window to see the angry mob outside, their collective animosity palpable. He looked back down at Maria's battered frame and knew it was only a matter of time before the village turned on her as well. She had been kind to Gregor, perhaps the only person in New Augsburg who had befriended him. Alos knew the mindset of the villagers. He knew it far too well. She would be shunned from the community at the very least, and most likely would be in far greater danger. He was going to have to act, and act fast, in order to save the woman he loved. As Newberry returned from the cemetery to the commotion of the village, he took up guard over Gregor with Rawlings, assessing the fevered situation at hand. The furious throng of villagers were shouting and crying, their anger boiling over into the courtyard. They demanded recompense for these horrors, and they wanted Gregor to pay. The indignant horde crowded in and surrounded the detectives as the threat of violence escalated. From out of the midst of the rampaging villagers, Elder Fisher approached Newberry and Rawlings. He had a solemn, anguished look about him as he calmly spoke to the detectives.
"I think you gentlemen had better hand this matter over to us now."
Newberry, shocked at this revelation, replied,
"Are you mad? This man may well claim death as his price for what he has done, truly, but only after a trial by jury. You can't just do with him what you will. Surely you see that, Mr. Fisher."
"We can,"
Elder Fisher explained coldly.
"And we will. Death is the price that we all must pay as sinners, Mr. Newberry. His trial has already taken place, and the verdict has been handed down by our Lord God himself. As I told you before, we see to our own matters here, and we intend to do just that. Please step aside, gentlemen, so that the Lord's justice can be carried out upon this heathen, and our village can be rid of this blight."
The crowd then began to overwhelm the detectives, pushing and shoving the two men aside as it converged on the entry to the makeshift cell. The doorway was thrown open, and the mob rushed inside like an army of ants, united in their communal duty. As the detectives were unwillingly thrust back and out of the fold, Alos appeared from behind them and quietly pled to them.
"Sirs, if you would please come with me. I need your help immediately."
Realizing their resistance to this mayhem was now hopeless, they agreed and followed Alos. Once safely inside the doctor's house again, Alos explained to the detectives the peril that Maria faced. A glance outside, Gregor being dragged like a rag doll out into the street, confirmed that danger. Maria laid still on a bed before them, in and out of consciousness, her breathing slow but steady. The men nodded in agreement to one another as Newberry spoke.
"What would you have us do?"
Alos asked the detectives.
"Does your carriage have space enough for 2 more passengers?"
2 days later. The villagers of New Augsburg stood crowded around the newly constructed gallows. Most of them were somber, yet resolute, as they awaited this morning's morbid event. Gregor was conscious but still unresponsive as two men shouldered him through the crowd and up the wooden steps. A few angry wails resounded from the crowd below as a thick cord of rope was drawn around his neck and tightened. Women and children began to cry and turn their heads, unable to witness the execution. Elder Fisher said a short prayer for the victims before stepping down, the time for God's justice having arrived. With a swift pull of a lever, the floor beneath Gregor gave way, and he dropped like a stone toward the ground below. With a sharp crack against the unforgiving noose, his neck snapped instantly, and he hung limp, his broken body swaying only slightly in the wind. Newberry and Rawlings approached the seaport that afternoon. It was gray and overcast as Alos emerged from the carriage, helping Maria out after him. Alos had explained to her as they traveled that he was certain his relatives could help them start a new life. He said that they were indeed far removed, but family nonetheless. She agreed with his plan to board a ship bound for the old country. His relatives lived in Strons, a small village in northern Austria. They thanked the detectives for the help in securing their passage, then hurried away toward the departing vessel. At the small cemetery in the woods outside New Augsburg, a deep, unmarked grave laid gaping open, far away from the other tombstones. Without ceremony, the body and belongings of Gregor Martin were carelessly pitched into the ragged cavity. His mangled corpse lay slipshod alongside a smooth, leather-bound book on the earthen floor. The villagers, grateful to be rid of this evil, worked quickly to bury his memory along with his remains, and soon both were concealed under 6 feet of dirt and rock. 1 year later, 1837. Life in New Augsburg recovered, and in time it returned to the simple, serene rural community it had once been. Memories of the tragedy remained, but seldom was a word of it ever spoken throughout the village. They established a new burial place later that year, and the small cemetery in the woods was left to neglect and all but forgotten. Newberry and Rawlings kept busy on new murder cases in and around Baltimore. The brutal and savage crimes seemed to escalate in severity year after year. They wondered if the world was becoming more evil, or if they were just becoming relics of a less violent time. They never forgot the case from rural Lancaster County. They had been forced to record it as unsolved. They had always regretted that decision, and they pondered the fate of the couple from New Augsburg whom they had helped to escape. Presently, they got back to work, inundated by the deluge of new cases that grew larger each day. Alos and Maria made it to Strons after several weeks of travel. They sought out and found his relatives. Unfortunately, Alos had contracted typhus on the long voyage across the sea and succumbed to the disease within a month after their arrival to the village. Johann and Theresia Schickelgruber, Alos's great-aunt and uncle twice removed, took pity on them, and upon his death, agreed to treat Maria as one of their own, particularly compassionate with her because of her blossoming pregnancy. They had assumed it was Alos's child, and Maria did not dissuade them, although she knew the truth of the matter. In flashing recollections during her persistent nightmares, she could faintly recall sporadic and terrifying moments of that dreadful night, and how Gregor had violated her. This was the child of a monster. She detested the thing growing inside her, but over the course of her term, that fear and disgust eventually subsided, turning to love and adoration the moment her baby was born. She named him Alos.
Journal entry, 1st of September, 1939. Number 2. My prize is on its way into my hands at this very second, so I must be brief in my writing. It is a very special omen indeed that its arrival comes on this day in particular. There are, however, many other duties I must attend to in the days and weeks ahead. Therefore, I will most likely not find the opportunity to log another entry for some time. That being said, I most certainly intend on detailing my thoughts and experiences with this most prized family artifact as soon as possible. In closing, one of the last important pieces of my ancestry has been identified. The notion of plumbing these unknown depths of my paternal heritage is intoxicating. I have waited quite a long time in hopes of finally meeting my true grandsire and gaining a higher understanding of what might be revealed to me once we are at last introduced. Ah, my men have arrived. Until next time. Upon completing this entry, he put away his journal, locking it into the top desk drawer. "Enter," he barked, after another quick knock rattled his office door. The two large men entered, now dressed identically in full military regalia. Their ominous black uniforms and unique insignia identified them as officers of the SS division within the Third Reich. One of the officers had a large bag hoisted over his shoulder as the pair strode across the grand office. The office was well appointed. Heavy oak furniture, stained a dark brown and upholstered in fine leather, adorned the room. There were large maps, pinned in specific locations, framed on the walls, flanked by two massive blood-red tapestries. These gargantuan drapes hung down to the floor from a tall ceiling, and both featured a large white circle in the center, emblazoned with a rigid black swastika. Once a sacred marking of ancient Eastern religions, the swastika now evoked fear and revulsion in the hearts of people around the world as the defining symbol of the Nazi regime in Germany. The militant pair approached the man seated at the large desk. The officer holding the bag pulled it from his shoulder and opened it. He retrieved a worn old leather-bound book, property of Gregor Martin, scrawled across the cover, barely legible. After placing the book gently onto the desk, he immediately snapped back to attention. Both officers stood fixed, staring blankly forward.
"Very good. You may go,"
the man spoke sharply, and the officers turned on their heels and marched back out of the office, closing the door behind them. Alone with his book at long last, he studied it reverently, gently running his fingers over the cover, and then poring over the pages, turning them with great care and consideration. After several minutes, he gingerly closed the book and stood. He carried it to an ornate cabinet on the wall behind his desk. Pulling a small key from his jacket pocket, he inserted it into the lock on the cabinet door and turned. As the door of the little vault opened, it revealed an array of curious items, drawing a thin smile across his pale face. His eyes sparkled, euphoric at the sight of his secret collection. He carefully placed the book on a shelf between a small disfigured human skull and a sealed glass jar containing some sort of fetus suspended in a cloudy liquid. After a few moments of admiration, he closed and locked the cabinet with a satisfied exhalation. He walked to a set of double doors centered on the back wall of his office. Opening them wide, he stepped outside onto his balcony to look down on the city of Berlin from 2 stories above. Cool air swirled and whistled around him as Adolf Hitler thrust his arm up and forward in the Nazi salute. On the streets below, thousands of German soldiers marched in lockstep, mirroring that same salute and erupting with Sieg Heil in a deafening chorus.
That day, the German army began their invasion and occupation of Poland, marking the beginning of the Second World War. 6 years later, World War II came to an end. The Allied powers ultimately triumphed over Germany and the Axis powers after a long and bloody struggle. The war cost millions upon millions of human lives and changed the world forever. As Berlin was brought to its knees and the war was coming to a close, Allied soldiers descended upon the stronghold where the Nazi dictator was thought to be hiding. They discovered remnants of 2 burned bodies. Although widely accepted as the remains of the Führer and his wife, Eva Braun, no evidence positively identifying the body of Adolf Hitler has ever been found. After the war, an inventory was taken of Hitler's belongings. Among many other items, a treasure trove of strange occult artifacts were found, catalogued, and stored for historical purposes. Missing from this collection, however, was his most valued asset. No written record has ever documented the existence of an antique leather-bound book, once a possession of his estranged grandfather, Gregor Martin, a mystic and a murderer who may well have escaped the small Amish village of New Augsburg after all. This has been Power in the Blood, written by Tom Burns, narrated by Kenneth Turner. Text and audio production copyright 2015 by Tom Burns, all rights reserved. The narrator would like to thank Mandy Blasberg. This is a work of fiction. People, places, events, and situations are the product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or historical events is purely coincidental. The views expressed in this work are solely those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the views of the publishers.